Ron Howard was walking the red carpet at his own premiere when his lead actor leaned in, smiled for the cameras, and whispered 4 words that made Ron's blood run cold. "I know what you did. Listen closely, because what happens in the next 90 seconds, with 300 photographers watching and the whole world about to see this film, will determine whether tonight becomes a celebration or a scandal that follows Ron for the rest of his career." The red carpet stretched out like a river of crimson beneath the California twilight, flanked by velvet ropes and metal barriers. Flashbulbs popped in rhythmic waves, creating a strobe effect that made everything feel unreal. The air smelled of expensive perfume and desperation, the particular desperation of publicists trying to get clients photographed, of journalists shouting questions, of fans holding signs and hoping for connection. Ron had walked red carpets for 40 years, but this one felt different. This one felt like walking into an ambush. The actor's name was Daniel Cross, 36 years old, classically trained, critically acclaimed, the kind of performer who disappeared so completely into roles that audiences forgot they were watching someone pretend. Ron had cast him 18 months ago after a single audition. Daniel had become the heart of this film, and now he was standing 3 inches from Ron's ear, still smiling for cameras, whispering words that threatened to destroy everything. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from, and what time is it right now? Because wherever you are, I need you to understand what it feels like to stand in front of the entire world and realize that someone next to you is about to tear it all down. Here's the first thing I need you to hold on to. What did Ron do and how did Daniel find out? I'll tell you. But first you need to understand what was at stake on that red carpet, beyond just one night and one film. The movie was called The Weight of Silence. It was a drama about a father who discovers a terrible secret about his own past and must decide whether to reveal it or protect the family he's built. The script had come to Ron 3 years ago, had haunted him in ways that scripts rarely did. He'd spent 2 years developing it, fighting for financing, assembling a cast that could handle material this delicate. The production had been difficult, emotionally draining for everyone involved, but the result was something Ron believed might be the best work of his career. Critics who had seen early screenings were calling it a masterpiece. Oscar buzz had already begun. Tonight was supposed to be a coronation. But Daniel Cross knew something, and whatever he knew, it was enough to make him choose this moment, the most public moment possible, to confront Ron about it. Stop for a second and picture this red carpet from above, because who stood where will matter more than you think. Ron was in the center of the carpet, positioned for the main photo opportunity. Daniel was beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Behind them, the rest of the cast waited in a loose cluster, the supporting actors, the producers, the studio executives who had bankrolled this dream. Ahead of them, a wall of photographers stretched 30 feet wide, every lens pointed at the 2 men who had made this film together. And somewhere in the crowd, Ron knew, were entertainment reporters with microphones and cameras, ready to capture anything that might become tomorrow's headline. "Keep smiling," Daniel said through his teeth, his voice barely audible above the noise of the crowd. "We're going to have a conversation, and you're going to answer my questions, and we're going to do it right here, where you can't run away." Notice what Ron does in this moment, because it tells you everything about the kind of person he is under pressure. He doesn't panic. He doesn't pull away. He doesn't signal to his publicist for help. Instead, he puts his hand on Daniel's shoulder, a gesture that looks friendly and natural to everyone watching, and says quietly, "Whatever you think you know, this isn't the place." "This is exactly the place," Daniel replied, "because if I don't get answers right now, I'm going to walk up to that microphone in about 2 minutes and tell everyone what I found in your files." Wait, because what Daniel is threatening to reveal goes back further than this film, further than their professional relationship, all the way to a decision Ron made decades ago that he thought no one would ever discover. The photographers were shouting now, calling for Ron and Daniel to look this way, to smile, to give them something they could use. Ron kept his expression pleasant, his posture relaxed, while inside his mind raced through possibilities. What files? What could Daniel have found? And more importantly, how much time did he have before this situation spiraled beyond his control? 60 seconds, Daniel said, still smiling, still playing the part of the devoted collaborator. That's how long before they call us for interviews. 60 seconds to tell me the truth about Michael Reeves. The name hit Ron like a physical blow. Michael Reeves. A name he hadn't heard, spoken aloud, in almost 30 years. A name connected to the darkest chapter of his early career, a chapter he had worked so hard to close and forget. Listen closely now, because in about 8 minutes, Ron will be standing at a podium, introducing this film to an audience of 1,200 people. 8 minutes to resolve a confrontation 30 years in the making, to protect a secret he thought was buried forever, and to decide whether the truth is worth more than everything he's built. I don't know what you think you found, Ron said carefully, but whatever it is, you're missing context. There's more to that story than whatever's in those files. Then tell me, right now. Tell me who Michael Reeves was, and why his name is all over your early production notes with the words terminated and removed from credits and do not contact written next to it. Before we go any further, you need to understand something about the entertainment industry in 1987 that most people have forgotten or never knew in the first place. Remember this detail, because it becomes important later. Michael Reeves was a young writer, 24 years old, brilliant, ambitious, difficult, in the way that brilliant young people sometimes are. He'd written a script that Ron had fallen in love with, a script that eventually became Ron's first major critical success as a director. But somewhere during the production, something had gone wrong. Michael had been removed from the project. His name had been taken off the credits, and within a year, he had left the industry entirely, disappearing into obscurity while Ron's career continued to rise. The official story was creative differences. The official story was that Michael had been difficult to work with, had missed deadlines, had clashed with producers. The official story was the one that had been repeated so many times that most people who remembered it at all accepted it as fact. But Daniel had found the files. Daniel had seen something that made him question the official story, and now he wanted answers. 45 seconds, Daniel said. His smile was starting to look strained now, the effort of maintaining the facade beginning to show. I found the memos, Ron. The ones where you admitted that the rewrites were mostly his ideas. The ones where you asked the studio to minimize his credit because you wanted the screenplay nomination for yourself. Ron felt something cold settle into his stomach. Not fear, exactly. Something closer to resignation. The weight of a lie he'd been carrying for 3 decades, finally demanding to be acknowledged. Hold this moment in your mind, because when we come back to it at the end, you won't see Ron the same way again. He had a choice to make. He could deny everything, hope that Daniel's evidence wasn't as damning as it sounded, and risk having this confrontation play out in public. Or he could tell the truth, the full truth, including the parts he'd never told anyone, and hope that Daniel would understand. You're right, Ron said quietly. About the rewrites. Michael deserved more credit than he got. That was wrong, and I've regretted it for 30 years. Daniel's expression flickered, surprise mixed with something else, maybe the beginning of respect for someone who would admit fault so directly. Then why? Why did you push him out? I didn't push him out. He was pushed out by the studio, and I didn't fight hard enough to stop it. There's a difference, but it doesn't make me less guilty. That's not what the memos say. The memos don't tell the whole story. Notice what happens when Ron starts telling the truth. The tension between them shifts. Daniel's posture changes slightly, becoming less aggressive, more curious. The wall of cameras continues to flash around them, capturing images that will be analyzed for decades. Two men standing close together on a red carpet, having a conversation that looks perfectly normal from the outside. Then tell me the whole story. You've got 30 seconds. Ron glanced toward the press line, where a publicist was starting to wave them forward. 30 seconds. Not enough time to explain 30 years of guilt and justification, but maybe enough time to plant a seed. Michael and I had a disagreement during production, not about the script, about something personal, something that happened between him and one of our producers. I found out about it. I confronted the producer, and the producer told the studio that either Michael went or he walked. The studio chose to keep the producer. Ron paused, watching Daniel's face. I should have walked too. I should have stood with Michael, but I was young, and I was scared, and I told myself that I could do more good by staying and making the film as close to his vision as possible. It was the wrong choice. I've known it was the wrong choice every day since. Wait. Because what Ron is about to reveal will change Daniel's understanding of everything he thought he knew. What happened between Michael and the producer? The producer made advances. Michael reported it. And in 1987, reporting something like that wasn't like it is now. The person who reported usually lost. Michael lost. And I was too much of a coward to lose with him. The publicist was getting closer now, her smile fixed and professional, ready to guide them toward the interview gauntlet. 20 seconds, maybe less. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The cameras continued to flash. The crowd continued to shout, and somewhere beneath all that noise, something was shifting between the two men on the red carpet. Before we continue, I need you to understand what was happening inside Daniel Cross's mind during those seconds of silence. Daniel had found the files by accident. He'd been researching Ron's early career for an interview, had gotten access to archived production documents through a contact at the studio, had stumbled onto correspondence that seemed to tell a story of credit theft and professional betrayal. He'd spent weeks building a case in his mind, convincing himself that the director he'd admired and trusted was actually a fraud who had built his reputation on someone else's work. But now Ron was standing in front of him, admitting fault. Yes, but describing something more complicated than simple theft. Describing a system that destroyed people for speaking up. Describing his own failure to fight that system. Describing 30 years of carrying a guilt that most people would have found a way to rationalize away. Why didn't you ever try to make it right? Daniel asked. Why didn't you find Michael, apologize, try to get him back into the industry? I did try to find him, twice. The first time was in 1995. I hired a private investigator to track him down. He'd moved to Montana, was teaching high school English. He was married, had a daughter. Seemed happy. I wrote him a letter. Ron's voice dropped even lower. He never responded. And the second time? 2012. His daughter reached out to me. Michael had died 2 years earlier. Cancer. She said he'd kept my letter, had read it many times, but had never been able to forgive me. She said he'd told her that some wounds don't heal. They just stop bleeding for a while. Listen to what happens next, because this is the moment that changes everything about how Daniel sees the man standing beside him. The publicist arrived, her smile bright and professional. Gentlemen, they're ready for you at the press line. Big smiles, lots of energy. Daniel looked at her, then back at Ron. The cameras were still flashing. The crowd was still shouting. And in about 3 minutes, they would both be standing in front of microphones, answering questions about a film that was supposed to be the highlight of their careers. One more question, Daniel said, ignoring the publicist's increasingly urgent gestures. The movie we just made, The Father, who discovers a terrible secret about his past. That's not just a story, is it? That's you. You've been making a film about your own guilt this whole time. Ron met his eyes directly. Every film I've made since 1987 has been in some way about trying to understand how good people do terrible things and have to live with the consequences. So yes, this one more than most. Remember the 3 questions I opened at the beginning of this story. Now watch how they start to come together. The press line was a blur of lights and microphones, and questions that Ron answered on autopilot. How does it feel to premiere such a personal film? Amazing. What was it like working with Daniel Cross? A privilege. Are the Oscar rumors true? It's too early to think about that. The words came out smoothly, professionally, while inside Ron's mind kept returning to the conversation on the carpet and the decision that Daniel was still making. Because Daniel hadn't said what he was going to do. He hadn't promised to keep the secret. He hadn't agreed that Ron's confession was enough. He was still carrying those files, still carrying the evidence that could turn tonight's celebration into a career-ending scandal. And Ron had no way of knowing which way he would choose. Stop for a second and picture what's happening behind Daniel's eyes right now. He came here tonight, prepared to expose a fraud. He came here armed with evidence and righteous anger, and the certainty that he was about to do something important. But the conversation on the carpet had complicated everything. The man he'd been prepared to destroy had turned out to be something more nuanced than a villain. Someone who had done wrong, yes, but who had also spent 30 years carrying the weight of that wrong, letting it shape his work, letting it haunt him in ways that Daniel was only beginning to understand. The theater lobby was filling up now. Elegantly dressed guests, mingling with champagne glasses and expectant energy. In 15 minutes, the lights would dim, and the film would begin, and everything that happened on that red carpet would be temporarily forgotten. But Daniel knew that the moment the credits rolled, the questions would start again, and he still hadn't decided what he was going to do with what he knew. "Can we talk?" Ron appeared at Daniel's elbow, 2 glasses of sparkling water in his hands. Somewhere quieter. Daniel took the glass, nodded toward a hallway that led to the theater's administrative offices. 5 minutes. That's all I can give you before we have to be in our seats. Hold this moment, because what happens in this conversation will determine the future of both men's careers. The hallway was dimmer than the lobby. The sounds of the crowd, muffled by heavy doors. Ron leaned against the wall, suddenly looking older than his years, the weight of the evening finally showing on his face. "I know you came here planning to expose me," Ron said, "and I'm not going to ask you not to. What I did to Michael, what I let happen to him, that deserves to be exposed. If you decide to go public, I won't fight you. I won't deny it. I'll confirm everything you've found and add the details you don't have." Daniel studied him for a long moment. "You'd do that? You'd end your own career?" "My career isn't worth protecting if it's built on someone else's pain. I've known that for 30 years. I just didn't have the courage to act on it until someone forced my hand." "What about the film? What about everyone who worked on it? If this comes out tonight, the movie dies. No one will be able to see it without thinking about the scandal." Coyne closed his eyes for a moment. "That's the part I can't make peace with. All those people who put their hearts into this work, who deserve to have it seen and appreciated on its own merits. If you expose me tonight, I'm not the only one who loses. They lose too." Notice the calculation happening in Daniel's mind. He's weighing justice against consequence, principle against pragmatism, the satisfaction of exposing a wrong against the damage that exposure would cause to innocent people. "What if there was another way?" Daniel said slowly, an idea forming as he spoke. "What if you told the story yourself, not tonight, not in the middle of the premiere, but soon, a public statement, an acknowledgement of what happened to Michael, a donation to organizations that support people who report harassment in the industry, something that turns your guilt into action." Ron opened his eyes. "You'd trust me to do that? After everything I've admitted?" "I don't know yet. But I know that destroying you tonight doesn't bring Michael back. It doesn't undo what happened in 1987. It just creates more wreckage." Daniel paused, choosing his words carefully. "You made a film about a man who has to choose between protecting himself and telling the truth. Maybe it's time you lived that story instead of just directing it." Before we continue, I need you to understand the risk Daniel was taking by offering this alternative. He had evidence that could make headlines around the world. He had the moral high ground. He had every justification for walking into that theater and announcing to 1,200 people that the director they were about to celebrate was a fraud who had stolen credit and abandoned a colleague to protect his own career. No one would have blamed him. Most people would have applauded. But Daniel had spent the last 2 years working with Ron on the most emotionally demanding project of his career. He'd watched Ron push for authenticity even when it was difficult. He'd seen him treat every crew member with respect. He'd heard the stories about how Ron had quietly supported young filmmakers, had advocated for diverse voices, had used his power to create opportunities for people who might otherwise have been overlooked. None of that erased what had happened to Michael Reeves, but it complicated the simple narrative of hero and villain that Daniel had constructed in his mind. Wait, because what happens in the theater is going to test whether Ron meant what he said. The lights dimmed, the audience settled into their seats, and Ron Howard walked to the podium to introduce the film he'd spent 3 years making, the film about secrets and guilt, and the impossible choices that define who we become. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Ron said, his voice steady, despite everything churning beneath the surface. "Before we begin, I want to say something that isn't in my prepared remarks." Daniel tensed in his seat, watching, waiting. This film is about a man who carries a secret for decades, who builds a life on top of that secret, and who finally has to reckon with what he's buried. It's a story about the price of silence and the even higher price of truth. Ron paused, looking out at the audience. "I want to dedicate this film to everyone who has ever had to choose between protecting themselves and doing what's right. And I want to acknowledge that I haven't always made that choice well, but I'm still learning. We're all still learning." Listen to what happens in the silence after Ron finishes speaking. The audience didn't know exactly what he meant. They couldn't have known, but something in his tone, something in the way he delivered those words, made the moment feel heavier than a typical premiere introduction. There was scattered applause, uncertain at first, then building as people decided to accept the sentiment at face value. And Daniel, sitting in the third row, felt something shift in his chest. Not forgiveness, exactly, something more like the beginning of understanding. The third question was about whether this night would become a celebration or a scandal. The answer was neither, or perhaps both. The film premiered to a standing ovation. Critics who had seen it early had their impressions confirmed. The Oscar buzz continued to build, but underneath all of that, something else was happening, a private reckoning that would play out over the months to come. The second question was about what Ron had done. The answer was complicated. He had failed to protect someone who needed protection. He had benefited from that failure. He had carried the guilt of it for 30 years, letting it shape his work, letting it haunt his quiet moments. He hadn't been a villain in the simple sense that Daniel had first imagined, but he hadn't been innocent either. He had been human, flawed, and frightened, and ultimately unable to be the person he wished he had been. The first question was about how Daniel found out. The answer came later, after the premiere, after the reviews, after the awards season that brought Ron his third Oscar nomination. Daniel had been researching for a profile piece and had stumbled onto archived files that a studio archivist had digitized without fully reviewing. Pure chance, the kind of accident that reveals secrets no one intended to share. 6 weeks after the premiere, Ron held a press conference. He told the story of Michael Reeves publicly. For the first time, he acknowledged what he had done and what he had failed to do. He announced a scholarship fund in Michael's name for young screenwriters and a donation to organizations supporting people who report harassment in the entertainment industry. The response was mixed, as all responses to complicated truths usually are. Some people praised his honesty. Others accused him of trying to control the narrative before someone else could expose him. Some said it was too little, too late. Others said it was exactly the kind of accountability the industry needed to see. But here's what mattered most. Michael Reeves's daughter watched the press conference. She saw Ron speak her father's name in front of cameras, saw him acknowledge the wrong that had been done, saw him try, imperfectly, inadequately, but sincerely, to make amends for something that could never truly be made right. She sent Ron a letter afterward. It was short. It didn't offer forgiveness, but it thanked him for finally telling the truth. And Ron Howard? He kept directing. He kept making films about flawed people facing impossible choices. The Weight of Silence won 3 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. In his acceptance speech, Ron thanked his cast and crew, thanked his family, thanked the Academy, and at the end, he said something that most people in the audience didn't fully understand. I want to thank Michael Reeves, who taught me 37 years ago that every story has a cost, and that the people who pay that cost deserve to be remembered. Here's the final question I want to leave you with. What do you do when someone discovers the worst thing you've ever done? You can deny it. You can justify it. You can attack the person who found it. Or you can do what Ron did. Acknowledge it. Accept responsibility. And try to turn your guilt into something that helps the people who come after you. It doesn't erase the past. It doesn't bring back the people who were hurt. But it's the only response that offers any possibility of redemption. That's the story of what happened on the red carpet. The night a secret 30 years old threatened to destroy everything Ron Howard had built, and the choice he made to let the truth cost him whatever it was going to cost. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments below. And if you want to hear about the night Ron had to choose between his film and his family, let me know. That story has been waiting for a very long time to be told.